David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, I am back from vacation. The whole team is back. I'll have some pretty good vacation stories, actually, from very sunny and humid Aruba on today's bonus show. But one of the things that I did during the break, or I guess sort of didn't do, I completely tuned out political news and really news of all kind during the vacation. And then when I got back, I started the process of catching up on what I'd missed to be ready for today's show. And it gave me some really good perspective, in a sense. I missed a ton, including a ton of erratic, unhinged statements and actions from Donald Trump. And yet here we are, 10 days since the last new show. And in a sense, nothing has changed. And I want to see if I can explain it in a very particular way. Lots of things happened while I was gone, but nothing changed in that Trump is still a threat to our economy. Trump is still a threat to the planet. Our allies are still disgusted with Donald Trump, and our relationships with other countries continue to be worse than they've been in a very long time. And what we have to understand is that the media outrage rounds that take place with every stupid and crazy thing that Donald Trump does don't change the reality of the policy that the Donald Trump administration is putting out there. So while I was gone, Donald Trump said, migrants at the U.S. border under U.S. custody won't get the flu vaccine. This is horrible. This leads to actual deaths. The administration is exceeding their own limit for how long people are supposed to be held and ignoring their own limit that they've placed. Trump said Jews who vote for Democrats are disloyal to Israel, which is, of course, premised on a totally anti-Semitic notion of dual loyalty to Israel in the U.S. that American Jews supposedly have, according to people like Donald Trump. When Danish leadership told Donald Trump Greenland isn't for sale, Trump erratically canceled his visit there. I mean, just a total embarrassment globally on all fronts. Despite having said he was going to push for gun control, gun safety regulations in the form of universal background checks, Trump has bowed to the NRA and said, nah, not interested in doing those background checks anymore. Trump called himself the chosen one during another one of these erratic rants. Any one of these would have been a scandal at any point during the Obama presidency. This was 1 week of Donald Trump while I was on vacation. And I'm sure I'm missing things, by the way. But in the end, nothing changed during those 10 days. The immigration policy of the Trump administration is a humanitarian emergency. It was before my vacation, and it continues to be. Our trade policy was a self-destructive joke before the break, and after it, it's worse now, and I'll talk about that later on in the program. I don't mean that there's no impact for each of the things that Donald Trump does. Trump says no flu vaccine. People die of the flu. I mean, this is very real in that sense. But what I mean is that the big picture has not changed. We have an erratic, ignorant megalomaniac who is in charge of the United States. The Republican Party is halfway complicit and halfway indifferent, and some sliver actually likes it. And we need to be focused on making the big changes that will put a stop to this, which starts with removing the president, but it's got to include taking control back of the Supreme Court and the lower courts, which increasingly with every passing month, Donald Trump controls more and more of. We've got to repair the relationships with other countries, starting to be reasonable with people around the world instead of being the petulant child that everyone ignores because there's no reasoning with them. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. This is a daily show that I do. And what I tell you is what's going on. I'm going to continue to make the effort to contextualize it, explain why the day-to-day matters, explain what we can do, something, because we need to be doing more than the outrage porn stuff. No one really benefits from that. This isn't me saying let's bury our heads in the sand and ignore the news, but it's let's be more thoughtful and specific about how we work with the news that we hear and actually try to turn it into something. Activism, knowledge that becomes usable, catalyzing voting. It's got to go beyond the outrage porn, and not paying attention to the news for this week confirmed that, number one, it's important to pay attention to the news, but we've got to be doing it in a particular way where we understand that each individual news story is not changing or shaping the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is the important context that we need to understand. So that's my sort of refocus as I come back from the vacation. And a lot of that is going to happen immediately on this show. And in fact, we've got to go to trade policy next. I was welcomed back from my vacation last week to yet another day of massive stock market crashes on Friday. My mutual fund account looking very, very ugly. And at first I wasn't sure what had caused it because I wasn't following the news last week since we were on break. The Dow was down another more than 600 points. The NASDAQ and S&P 500 and the Russell 2000 all down the same or more on a percentage basis. And then on my flight home, I started catching up on news, getting ready for the week of shows, and realized, oh yeah, Donald Trump once again scaling up the trade war and straight up tweeting fascistic threats about controlling American companies. And once again, stocks are taking a dive. Donald Trump, yes, putting even more self-destructive tariffs on China. But before doing that, take a look at what the president of the United States tweeted. Quote, "Our country has lost, stupidly, trillions of dollars with China over many years. They have stolen our intellectual property at a rate of hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and they want to continue. I won't let that happen. We don't need China, and frankly, would be far better off without them. The vast amounts of money made and stolen by China from the United States year after year for decades will and must stop." Here's a key part. "Our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China, including bringing your companies home and making your products in the USA." Okay, it goes on from there. The key part is American companies are hereby ordered to immediately look for alternatives to China. What does that mean? It's completely perplexing from a legal point of view. First of all, as a tweet, does it count as a policy? Is it a formal directive? The consensus is no, it doesn't. But it still sounds official when you see the president saying companies are hereby ordered. But as a tweet alone, it is not law or a formal directive in and of itself. But then the question is that something Donald Trump is going to do? What is the legal basis for ordering companies to not deal with China? Is this some kind of de facto sanctions without actually putting in place sanctions? Is he threatening to put in place those real types of sanctions, which would be just an implosive act when it comes to the American economy, which I'll explain in more detail momentarily? This is the type of thing that actually happens in fascist dictatorships. It's the sort of mob-style authoritarian national politic. And then in come the tariffs, once again escalating these back and forth retaliatory tariffs from China on the U.S. and from the U.S. on China to our detriment. October 1, tariffs on $250 billion in imports go from 25 to 30%. Destructive. September 1, $300 billion will be taxed at 15% instead of 10%. Understand, there is no off-ramp here. This is crushing farmers. This is bad for builders. This is bad for all sorts of everyday Americans. We are told that eventually these tariffs will be so destructive to China that China will cave and come to Trump begging and pleading, and Trump's going to win and everybody's going to be happy. It's not going to happen. Understand that a ton of the stuff that we sell to China, they can get elsewhere or they can make themselves. They're already turning to other countries for some building materials. They're making energy deals with Russia. The things we get from China would be way more expensive to either make here or get elsewhere. We don't have the leverage. This is not a political analysis. This is an economic reality. This is sort of like a mob dispute, except here, one side has no leverage but doesn't get it. In the mob, oftentimes, they know when they're beat. They know when they don't have leverage, and they adjust their behavior. Trump's behaving like a mob boss with leverage, but he doesn't have it. And we're increasingly out in this triangle of the world's superpowers, China, Russia, and the U.S., China and Russia increasingly working together more and more, while the United States is ignored and out and self-destructing with Donald Trump's trade policy. No one is denying that China has a human rights issue. No one is denying that they are doing horrible things when it comes to intellectual property. But this is just the logistical reality. They can bounce back from this trade war way more easily than we can. The markets are seeing it. We do not have the leverage. And Trump ignores that we have a trade deficit with China for a reason. This is like a fundamental misunderstanding. Trump says, look at our trade deficit with China. We import from them much more than we export. That's the definition of a trade deficit. That's a sign that we are losing to China. We designed our economy to have a trade deficit with China. What I mean is we can import tons of cheap stuff from them, and it's good for our economy in a particular way. There's good and bad to all of these arrangements. This type of situation has winners and losers in different ways. But Republicans and Democrats both wanted a trade deficit, even if they didn't say we want a trade deficit, in that the whole point was, let's get a bunch of stuff from China because it's so cheap, and then we can make it available in the United States to people at far lower costs than they would be if we were to manufacture ourselves or in higher cost of production countries. Republicans and Democrats both wanted it. We knew that it would have a jobs cost, and it has, and that's a perfectly reasonable debate to have. But Donald Trump doesn't understand that. Donald Trump doesn't have an off-ramp from the tariffs, the trade war. Donald Trump doesn't understand that we have a trade deficit for a reason. It's not just China is winning or China has us over a barrel. And sadly, Trump's ignorant base never got it when Trump bragged about his expertise when it comes to trade. They still don't get it. And they'll probably still vote to reelect the guy in 2020. But this is the reality. The markets are suffering. Everyday people are suffering. Farmers are suffering. People that work for home builders are suffering. And Trump doesn't even seem to have the capacity to understand the mechanics behind it. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And make sure you follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. At least a couple of live streams happening this week on Twitch.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, great to be back from vacation and right back to thanking really great people who support The David Pakman Show. Today's new members of the day are Joan Spiegel and Larry Greenwell. Joan and Larry, really appreciate your support. Membership is the #1 funding source for our show. All other forms of revenue are erratic. They go up and down. But building membership support the way we've done for years now is the steadiest source of revenue for us. And that's why it's great to have people who have been members for almost 5 years, like Caitlin Henschel, who is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Join Joan, Larry, and Caitlin at www.joinpakman.com. There are things a president can do that we just think are the wrong policy. And there are things presidents sometimes do that make us question the entire democratic process. And I'm punching my mic already because I'm so fired up about this, that got the president elected in the first place. Today is one of those. Donald Trump has suggested multiple times that we should bomb hurricanes to stop them. It sounds like a satirical news headline. It sounds like a joke, but it's the suggestion not of a random 73-year-old guy that you just saw urinating underneath the subway platform. These are the words of a 73-year-old guy who happens to be president of the United States, and the White House is not denying it. Here's a paraphrased quote. This is the stuff of horrors. I got it. Why don't we nuke them? Trump said. They start forming off the coast of Africa. As they're moving across the Atlantic, we drop a bomb inside the eye of the hurricane and disrupt it. Why can't we do that? Per Axios, who is reporting on this, asked how the briefer reacted to Trump's suggestion. The source says that the briefer said to Trump, "Sir, we'll look into that." They're placating Trump. This is how it works behind the scenes. Trump says, what about bombing or nuking hurricanes? And they say, "Sir, we're going to take a look into that." Trump reiterated the suggestion that the government can intervene with bombs against hurricanes before they make landfall multiple times. And listen, Trump seems to think he knows a lot about nukes, right? Remember this beauty?
Having nuclear, my uncle was a great professor and scientist and engineer, Dr. John Trump at MIT. Good genes, very good genes, okay? Very smart. The Wharton School of Finance, very good, very smart. You know, if you're a conservative Republican, if I were a liberal, if I ran as a liberal Democrat, they would say I'm one of the smartest people anywhere in the world. It's true. But when you're a conservative Republican, they try, do they do a number? That's why I always started, went to Wharton, was a good student, went there, did this, built the, I have to give my credentials all the time because we're at a little disadvantage. But you look at the nuclear deal, the thing that really bothers me, it would have been so easy, and it's not as important as these lives are. Nuclear is so powerful. My uncle explained that to me many, many years ago, the power, and that was 35 years ago. He would explain the power of what's going to happen, and he was right. Who would have thought?
Yeah, so that was all one sentence, by the way. The briefer in another case, when Donald Trump suggested bombing hurricanes, was reportedly, quote, knocked back on his heels, and that it became so quiet in the room that you could hear a gnat fart in the meeting, according to a source that spoke to Axios. Trump has reportedly brought this idea up multiple times with the Department of Homeland Security, with national security officials, with a senior administration official. Asked about this, the White House is not denying it. They said, we don't comment on private discussions that the president may or may not have had with his national security team. That's an admission that this was suggested by Trump, okay? In the world of politics, if you are presented with something completely ridiculous that of course didn't happen, like, hey, we heard Donald Trump suggested going out and personally murdering people in the streets, like Trump wants to go out and shoot some people. Is that something Trump said? You would immediately have multiple officials saying, absolutely ridiculous. The reporting is false. Never said it. Absolutely ridiculous. They said something here that's almost as crazy. Why don't we bomb hurricanes? And the White House is saying, we don't comment on what the president did or didn't say. And there's another administration official who's actually defending the idea, saying that, quote, Donald Trump's goal is simply to keep catastrophic hurricanes from hitting the mainland, which is a good goal to have. This is a defense of the idea of bombing hurricanes that Donald Trump has suggested multiple times. So let's go through it. Trump's not the only person to think of this idea, okay? Back during the Eisenhower era, it was considered, we knew a lot less at the time, is it possible that we could use these new bombs that we made to disrupt hurricanes? 70 years ago, however long ago it was. Scientists agree it just won't work, period. The only disagreement that exists with this story is, did Trump suggest bombing or did Trump suggest nuking the hurricanes? So bombs, non-nuclear weapons versus nuclear weapons. There are reports of both. That's the only disagreement that really exists here. Now, it's also kind of interesting that in the background of this, once again, it's always near non-white people that Trump is thinking of dropping the bombs, right? Like, I get this is probably just a coincidence, but Trump is thinking, let's bomb the hurricanes where they form near Africa. Maybe coincidental, but just sort of notable nonetheless, given how this administration has been run. If Trump were a family member or a friend, if you cared about him, if Trump was a personal contact, you would have staged an intervention by now and you would have gotten the person some help. How did we elect someone this stupid or unhinged? And then the answer is, well, because 60 million people thought this was a good idea. And that basically tells you everything you need to know about the American electorate. This is a crisis. The crisis is Trump, but the crisis is also that there are tens of millions of people who are going to enthusiastically vote to reelect the guy in November of 2020. Ultimately, this is going to be a get out the vote election. And that relates to what I want to talk about next. Trump has been touting a 51% approval rating from some very specific right-leaning pollsters. But the reality is that Donald Trump's approval rating has dropped to its lowest in 2019, which is 36%. This is looking at one poll that has been done over time. It's the Associated Press poll. It's been tracking Trump's approval for his entire presidency. And right now, Trump's approval is 36%. His disapproval is 62%. So let's contextualize this. Let's explain why it matters. And then let's talk about how it relates to 2020. First of all, the context. Trump's approval has been in the range of 32 to 42 in the Associated Press poll since day one. So it didn't go lower than 32% approval. It's never been higher than 42% approval. That's a small range of only 10 points. That one thing that relates to is the hyper partisanship and polarization in the United States politically. We've talked about that before. Right now, Trump is at 36. That's pretty close to the middle of that 32 to 42 range, a little bit on the lower end. And that ties the lowest approval of 2019. So is this some kind of breaking news that changes everything, Trump approval at 36? Well, not in the sense that Trump is in the middle of the approval range that he's had all presidency. Secondly, some partisan context. If you look at Democrats, 95% disapprove of Trump. Republicans approve 79%, and independents approve 65%. That's an important number, the 79% that Republicans approve. This is important because Trump's been touting, and Republicans have been leaning on, Trump has 95% approval among Republicans. I don't know what poll that is. This is a good poll that we're looking at, and it says, hold on a second, 79% of Republicans approve of Trump. This matters in the context of a primary challenger, which now Donald Trump has in former Congressman Joe Walsh, and I'll be talking about that later in the show. 95% approval from your party and 79% approval from your party are two very different things. And in a primary, the goal of which would be not to defeat Donald Trump in the primary, it's not going to happen, but to do some damage to Trump, that is going to be significantly influenced by the difference between Republicans approving of Trump 79% versus 95%. So that's important. Also important, there are three areas where Republicans actually disapprove of Trump's handling more than they disapprove of him overall. So again, remember, 79% of Republicans approve of Trump. However, only 77% think he's handling healthcare correctly. Only 75% say he's handling foreign policy correctly, and only 70% believe he's handling gun policy correctly. This is important and it's interesting, but Republicans are not going to vote for a Democrat because they disagree with Trump on these issues. This is important to understand. For Democrats, gun policy isn't a voting issue, by and large. For Republicans, gun policy can be a voting issue if you are on the wrong side of more guns in more places. But the reality is, if you're a Republican and you don't love Trump's take on guns, you're not going to go and vote for a Democrat over that. That's the reality. Healthcare. A lot of these Republicans, 25% of them, they might recognize Trump is completely bungling healthcare, but they're not going to go and vote for a so-called socialist healthcare plan from a Democrat. They're still going to vote Trump. They just don't like what he's doing on healthcare. Similarly, foreign policy. Foreign policy is just not a voting issue in the way that domestic economic issues are. So that gets us to, what do we do with this data? Whether it's 36% approval or 32% approval, or even in the 20s, Donald Trump can still win re-election. I've run the numbers before with you. Half the country doesn't vote. You could have a 26% approval and turn out 1% more voters in some key states than the other party and win because half the country doesn't vote. So following Donald Trump's approval is relevant, and it helps us to understand how people, especially Republicans, are reacting to Trump. It does not tell us anything about what's going to happen in 2020. All you need to know is that Donald Trump could have a 36% approval rating and easily win. And by the way, the fact that he has a 36% approval rating tells us that there are tens of millions of people who are so disconnected from reality or ideologically blinded that they don't care what happens in the real world. They are voting for Trump in 2020, period. Okay. Trump has tens of millions of votes in 2020 already. It's August of 2019. The election's in November of 2020. Trump has tens of millions of votes. Once you know that, you realize this becomes get out the vote, because we're not going to be able to convince these people in any large numbers. I know I'm a broken record at this point. I've been talking about this for so long. This is going to be about get out the vote. That needs to be our priority in our context heading into 2020. Tell me if you think there is some other way in which Trump's approval is relevant beyond reminding us he's got tens of millions of votes in the bank already, and we've got to get the vote out. Follow us on Instagram at instagram.com/David Pakman Show. And I have a new story on my Instagram page, david.pakman. Got back from vacation. Big developments with my tomato plants. Huge developments. Make sure you're following me on Instagram at instagram.com/David.Pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
There's a very interesting development, which is that Donald Trump has a serious primary challenger. Now, let me sort of explain what I mean by serious. By serious, I don't mean someone that has any chance of actually beating Donald Trump in the Republican primary, but it's serious in that it's someone who is more of an actual Republican as far as the perception of him than William Weld, who's running against Trump, and his name is Joe Walsh. He's a former congressman. Joe Walsh told George Stephanopoulos on his ABC Sunday morning show yesterday that he is running for president in the Republican primary against Donald Trump.
The president points to often is just about every poll shows more than 80% support for the president among Republicans.
They don't have an alternative. I'll tell you what, George, and look, I'm running because he's unfit. Somebody needs to step up, and there needs to be an alternative. The country is sick of this guy's tantrum. He's a child. Again, the litany, he lies every time he opens his mouth.
Now, everything is working against this guy, okay? Trump has a very high approval rating among Republicans, but not as high as Trump thinks. Trump says it's a 95% approval rating. It's more like 80, according to a new Associated Press poll. Walsh has a lot of exploitable personal issues, including allegedly being a deadbeat dad. The Republican National Committee isn't going to support a primary challenge to Donald Trump. But, and this is the dream, Joe Walsh might be able to get in the way just enough to become an annoyance to Donald Trump, which would be really great. Trump has a high approval rating among Republicans, but it's not set in stone. Many Republicans say they support Trump merely because they don't like Democrats, and it's their way of showing it. But there is 21% of Republicans that already does not support Donald Trump. And that is a fifth of the party that might be interested in an alternative Republican to Donald Trump. The RNC won't support a primary challenge, but they don't even really need to, because the goal here is not to beat Trump in the primary in the same way that the goal of an impeachment inquiry isn't to remove Trump before 2020. The goal of all of these ideas is to weaken Donald Trump. So, do we on the left want people running against Trump from within the Republican Party? Absolutely. The stronger they are, the happier we are to see it. Democrats can just keep running their primary. And meanwhile, anything that could weaken Donald Trump is a good thing. Walsh running against Trump might lead to some money being spent that otherwise wouldn't. An impeachment inquiry would replace some Trump campaign media stories with some impeachment inquiry stories, and that could damage Donald Trump. Remember, 2016 was decided by 70,000 votes in 3 states. Any of these things that could weaken Donald Trump or interfere with Donald Trump being able to set the narrative, we should welcome and we should encourage. This is Donald Trump's strength. When he sets the narrative and gets the media in a frenzy, gets them spending 3, 5, or 7 days on something that Trump benefits from, or at least that Trump would prefer they focus on other than some more damaging thing, that is good for Donald Trump. Joe Walsh is a disgusting ideological clown. He's completely unqualified to be president of the United States. But Republicans already voted in a guy who's completely unqualified to be president. By all means, have at it, Joe. See what you can do. See what amount of support he can pick off from the Republican Party. And by the way, don't forget, and this is like the dream scenario, if Joe Walsh can get some traction with the fifth of the Republican Party that doesn't approve of Trump. Again, latest poll from the Associated Press, 79% of Republicans approve of Trump. 21% don't. Okay, that's 1/5 of Republicans. If Joe Walsh can pick up 3% support, 5% support in the Republican primary, obviously he loses the primary. that may be enough. It may give him enough money. It may give him enough momentum to say, you know what, I'm going to run as a third party. Because Joe Walsh has said he's a terrible guy, but he said he apologizes for his role in helping to elect Trump in 2016. If his goal is really to do anything he can to remove Trump, he might say, I'm going to run third party. And there, when you look at how close it was in so many key states, Wisconsin, Michigan, other states, Joe Walsh running as a Republican could actually, Joe Walsh running as an independent could actually take enough Republican votes away from Donald Trump that it flips one state to the eventual Democratic nominee, two states to the eventual Democratic nominee. So this is not strategy for the left. What we need to do is run a fair primary and then get people to vote. Get people to vote who otherwise wouldn't. Half the country doesn't vote. Find people who already agree with us. Tell them this was a very small margin in this state, in that state, in whichever state you should vote. That's still our strategy. But if Joe Walsh is going to create an annoying distraction, like a mosquito that you just can't get to leave you alone for Donald Trump up until the Republican National Convention, and then might actually run as an independent, he could single-handedly hand a state or two to the Democratic nominee and conceivably turn this election. It might not happen. We should support it because it does nothing bad for us and potentially does some good things. It's an obvious dead end in what it is, in that Trump is going to be the Republican nominee unless he were to drop out or something, who knows. But it is not a dead end in that it could have a real impact and really hurt Donald Trump in the eventual general election. If you disagree with me, tell me where I'm wrong on the numbers, okay? If you disagree with me for some other reason, I guess also let me know. But the real case I'm making is that mathematically this could have an impact that is not good for Donald Trump. I told you before our vacation last week that our friend JD Scholten is once again challenging incumbent, disgusting Republican Steve King in Iowa's 4th District in 2020. We met JD Scholten down at Netroots Nation in August of 2018. He ran against Steve King in 2018 and lost by only 3 points. Very sad, because it would have been amazing to knock off one of the most vile and despicable members of Congress. King is in trouble, and JD Scholten is running. King has said crazy things about abortion. King has reminisced about when white supremacy and white nationalism weren't offensive, saying to the New York Times during an interview, white nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization. How did that language become offensive? But King is in trouble. Republicans have abandoned him, and he has almost no money. This is so funny. King hasn't received one donation from a PAC associated with an existing member of Congress. This is a common way that these guys fund each other. Corporate PACs aren't donating to Steve King. Special interest groups aren't donating to Steve King. In the first 6 months of this year, King received two donations from third-party political entities. One was from Lamar Smith, a Lamar Smith associated PAC, former Republican congressman, and $2,000 from Todd Akin. Todd Akin is the guy who said that the body shuts down a legitimate rape and thus the woman can't get pregnant. That guy is saying, I want to donate $2,000 to Steve King. Republican Party groups are also not donating. So this guy can be defeated. Think back to 2018. JD Scholten lost by only 3 points in 2018, back when Steve King was still able to raise money. This guy, Steve King, is someone who came to power as a tool of big business, quite frankly. He came to power because the bankers gave him money. He came to power because big builders and companies like AT&T and Big Food gave him money. Big Insurance gave Steve King money. They're not giving him money this year. And that's really, really bad for Steve King. So as usual, there's the good and the bad. The good news is that without money, he can more easily lose to JD Scholten. The bad, or at least the troubling part, is how did it take until 2020 to realize for Republicans that they need to abandon this guy? And the answer is they don't really care. They're playing now like they're so disgusted with the things that Steve King has said. No, this is the same Steve King that's been around all along. And while this wasn't a problem for them, King was another vote in the House, and that's why they wanted it. It's not that he was someone that they disagreed with or agreed with or whatever, they were indifferent. They just want someone to check a box and say, yes, I'll vote Republican. Now he's become a PR problem, so they're abandoning him. Let's not attribute to morality and ethics what we can attribute merely to Republicans seeing politics as sport, wins and losses, checking boxes, and that's it. But he needs to go. Hopefully he will in 2020. Check out JD Scholten's campaign. JD is a former professional baseball player, super nice guy, hung out with him in 2018 in New Orleans, as I mentioned. He came so close in 2018 with the loss of Steve King's funding and the abandonment that Steve King is suffering from his Republican Party colleagues. This could be an amazing time to get a Democrat in the Iowa 4th Congressional District. Check it out. Check out JD Scholten, and hopefully we'll be talking to him on the program. We'll take a quick break. After this, we have extraordinarily great submissions for the David Pakman Show EDM dubstep voicemail remix theme song. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, then I think you're going to like it even more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, so the timing of our vacation ended up being perfect because we had this really funny voicemail a couple weeks ago where someone sort of sang to me in the voicemail, and I said, let's, anybody who's got some music production skills, turn this into like an EDM remix or do a dubstep remix or a parody or whatever. And they just poured in during the vacation, and I'm going to play some of them for you today. So this, I think a lot of people are going to like this. I know some people get mad when not everything is about politics, but there's a lot of different things that we talk about on the show. So I hope you'll enjoy this. Let's start with some of these are so good. Let me just remind you, this is the voicemail that came in a couple of weeks ago that is the source audio for much of what we're about to hear today. Take a listen.
The David Pakman Show, it's my favorite show. You do more good than you know. The David Pakman Show.
Exactly. So I asked, do something in the EDM style, do some kind of dubstep remix, use your creativity. They've poured in, okay? I've already had to narrow them down because there were just so many. This is a sampling. I do think that there are actually some contenders here for becoming our actual new intro theme song for the podcast, radio show, and television show. So I'm going to name these by number. I apologize in advance. If yours didn't make it, it's not that I didn't like it. It's that I had to do some sampling, some sub-selection, because otherwise this would take all day. If you want to vote on which should be the new theme song, I'm going to tell you the number. So I'll say this is number 1, this is number 2. There's only one way to vote, and that's by email using the contact form on our website. It's too hard to comb through YouTube comments and Twitter mentions and stuff like that. So go to davidpakman.com, click on contact, say I'm voting for number 1, number 2, number 3, whatever. You can even just do it in the subject line, and then you can, I guess you probably have to fill in the body to send the message, but you don't have to say much other than theme song, I'm voting, number 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. You can also say, by the way, keep the current theme song if you prefer that. We don't have to change it, but there's some really good stuff here. So the first submission that I will play is from Art Flores. Take a listen to this one.
David, 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 David.
Sort of down tempo.
David. You do more good than you know.
Okay, so I think you get the idea. That's number 1, okay? Number 1 from Art Flores. This is option number 2 from Psycho Nadia. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Take a listen. Very dark.
David Paxton Show, it's my favorite show. You do more good than you know. The David Paxton Show. David Paxton Show, it's
Right.
my favorite show. You do more good than you know. The David Paxton Show, it's my favorite show. You do more good than you know.
All right, so that's number 2, option 2 from Psycho Nadia. Here is number 3. This is from Andrew Worst, okay? Very different. Take a listen. Big lead up on this one.
It's the David Paxton Show. It's my favorite show. You do more good than you know. The David Paxton Show.
219 David P. I like that. 219 voicemail number.
The David Paxton Show. It's my favorite show. You do more good than you know. The David Paxton Show.
Okay, so that's number 3 from Andrew Worst. All right. This next one is number 4. Extremely high production value. Okay, this one is from, I don't know if it's pronounced Threlon and the Chosen Masters, or maybe it's just Elon with a 3. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. This has a number of parts. This is a extremely cinematic in nature. Take a listen to this.
My favorite show. You do more good than you know. You do more good than you know. The David Paxton Show.
Beautiful.
It's my favorite show. The David Paxton Show. The David Paxton Show.
There's even more to it. Just wait.
The David Paxton Show.
Okay, I think you get the idea. That is really something else. So that's number 4 from Threlon or Elon and the Chosen Masters. Okay, number 5. The only name I have for this one is Sorry for Bat English. That I don't know if that's a handle or what. Let's take a listen. This is number 5 now.
My favorite show. The David Paxton Show. It's my favorite show. You do more good than you know. The David Paxton Show. The David Paxton Show. Paxton Show.
Okay, so once again, that was number 5 from Sorry for Bat English. And then lastly, this is number 6 from Rob Bennett. Okay, so 1 through 6, this is number 6.
David Paxton Show. David Paxton. David Paxton
Right.
Show. David Paxton Show. It's the David Paxton Show. It's my favorite show. You do more good than you know. The David Paxton Show.
Yeah, so something sounding a little bit out of sync in that one, but I still like it and has some great stuff. So 1 through 6, all right? Get in touch via email from the website, davidpacman.com. Contact us. Tell me 1 through 6 or keep the current theme song. If you don't know that we have a theme song because you just watch clips on YouTube or whatever and you don't realize that the podcast, radio, and TV show have an intro theme song, then I don't know what you should do. Maybe don't email me. No, I mean, I guess just tell me which one of these you like. And if you don't think any of them are suitable, then let me know none of them are suitable. But awesome, awesome stuff. Those are just 6 of what must have been like 20 or so. And appreciate everybody who sent them in, even if it didn't make the final 6. Look forward to hearing from people. I guess we'll give it like a week, and maybe early next week I'll announce the results of the vote by mail. Okay, we do have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's an interesting and completely sincere question from a viewer. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, I'm wondering, when is the first time you really questioned your sexuality? And how did that come out, to I guess, Pat? I mean, would be the first option. How did he take that? And was he responsible, or was he sort of immature? Thanks.
Yeah, so completely sincere question. It's funny, by the way, obviously what they're saying is, when did I start to question my sexual orientation? The answer being never. When I was like 5, I knew I liked girls. But a lot of people say sexuality, which is not sexual orientation. If you actually look at the definition of sexuality, it's something else. And it's almost like a Freudian slip in a sense, where it's like, you're not even really asking me about what you think you're asking me about. But in any case, Pat took it all very professionally. I disclosed to Pat during the hiring process that I am exclusively dating women, and Pat said that that was completely fine, and he was completely responsible and professional in every way, and we've had no problems whatsoever. Thank you so much. Shockingly, now this is, I hesitate to even say this because I don't want to offend people. We got back from vacation and I had several hundred voicemails to go through to see what could I use on today's show. That was the best thing in terms of, when I listen to the voicemails, I'm listening to, is there a funny or interesting point? What's the caller's connection like? How long is the voicemail? Some people leave a 3-minute voicemail and then it maxes out. That's the max. And then they call back and say they need to add on to it. Like, have we ever played a 5-minute voicemail on the show? No. Once I eliminated bad audio, people that are droning on and on and on, things that just aren't interesting, unfortunately, some people who seem to maybe not be totally well, who call in regularly, I actually didn't have that many short, pithy, interesting ones. So, that's what we ended up with. It's disappointing, but alas, such is life. And that's, we're working with what we've got. That's all I can really do. And yes, I know, Eggman, you sent a couple. Your audio was disastrous during them, and it was completely unusable in every way. On today's bonus show, we will be talking about my vacation to Aruba. I will talk about the culture. I will talk about the cuisine. I will talk about the geography. I will talk about all sorts of other things from my trip on today's bonus show. We will also hear from producer Pat, who went on. I've deliberately not asked him anything about it yet. Pat was on another one of these road trip extravaganzas. This one, ideally short-circuiting the car trouble thing, because instead of doing the entire trip in a partially already broken down van, he flew out and rented a car for the beginning of the entire thing. National parks, Vegas, all sorts of other stuff. So I've heard nothing about it, and we're going to hear about it on the bonus show. So if you don't have access to the bonus show, become a member at www.joinpacman.com or become a patron at patreon.com/DavidPacmanShow. Both will give you instant access to the bonus show. If you're not going to see any of that stuff because you're not a member or a patron, you can see some of my vacation pictures and videos on my Instagram page at david.pacman on Instagram. But listen, you're really not going to get the full scope of it from 3 pictures and 1 video. Become a member, if not for anything other than hearing my vacation stories, which are substantive to say the least. I'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.